drugs, Hatch-Waxman, and generic drug legislation. Any of this gone over in detail last week, or is this sort of new territory? Okay, good. We'll talk about how drug companies game our system to maintain monopolies via packet thickets and a variety of other issues. That looks like that got left out. Dr. Lechton may have touched on some of that. And recent legislation and proposals to rein in drug prices. So let's start here. So this is a patient of mine who I've known for a while. Insulin-dependent diabetes. In 1996, a humanized Lispro insulin, rapid-acting insulin, was developed. Great stuff that's now standard part of medical care, and it was listed for $21 per vial. Well, somehow the price quadrupled, such that 2009, the same product sold by Lilly and a variety of other drugs by then was going for $93 per vial. 3 years later, no change in manufacturing, there was no tariffs at the time, no changes in costs made in the US, $212. And ultimately, well, that's now 8 years ago, still, the cost went up to $275 of the list price for the vial. And curiously, the cost in Canada remained about 32 bucks. So this is the pharmaceutical industry in the US. Bottom line, why? Because they can. There is no law other than that created for the Veterans Administration Hospital and Medicaid that regulated the cost of a drug. In fact, as you probably know, Medicare Part D prevented Medicare regulation or negotiation over the cost of pharmaceuticals. So we will see how that changed and how has that changed the cost of drugs? We'll see that too, I hope. So this is a dated slide. There's a ton of slides on this topic. It remains about the same, maybe a little better. By the way, everybody can see my slides, I hope. Um, that's good. I should ask that. And you can see yourselves too. Let me get you out of there. Um, so I like to use the word pricing failure because of all the market hype. We do fail in reducing prices despite a so-called free market, an uncontrolled free market, essentially. This is a slide familiar to all of you. Our costs are extraordinary compared to anywhere else in industrialized countries on Earth. Again, looking at it in another way, what percentage do other countries pay of the United States' costs for a particular drug? These are drugs that you guys will use in your practices. This is Keytruda, which is a chemotherapeutic agent, Enbrel, which is a commonly used agent for autoimmune disorders, Harvoni for hepatitis C, etc., Humira, the drug we are just talking about, insulin, Xarelto, an anticoagulant. So this is the cost in the US. This is the cost for all these products, 20%, 40%, maybe as much as 80%. One outlier for one chemotherapeutic agent in another country. So clearly this is known to you. However, what's also important to be known to you is the consequences for your patients. So 3 in 10 Americans don't take the medication as prescribed due to cost. They skip doses, they don't fill the prescription. And we've talked already here about how the US has the highest mortality among OECD nations related to amenable conditions. Well, this is one of those causes of why we have high mortality. If you drill down to ask why are folks not taking their medicines due to cost and how they're managing costs, they may switch to take an over-the-counter drug, and 20% of the time, 20% they won't fill it at all, and maybe 10 or 12% they'll cut the pills in half, adding up to that. And this is I'll provide these slides. So real effects on US, the percentage of patients who skip, again, compared, same statistics, but compared to other countries, we're 30% up here in the green bar. And this is folks who are below average income. It's 10% of people who have above average income. And this is the rest of the world in terms of their health systems, as you guys know, in presenting your topics as you have. So why do we allow these products? Well, hype. Red meat thrown out to the public, misinformation, nothing new there. That is, if you pay high prices for our innovative drugs, we're going to sink that money into the research to create the new wonder drugs of the future. And if you believe that lower drug prices will thwart such innovative research, then high drug prices and innovative research must be inextricably linked. And I've heard students say this to me. Oh, PNHP is talking about reducing the cost of pharmaceuticals. Won't we have less drugs? No, we won't have less drugs. It's the bottom line. Whoops, sorry. Even the pharmaceutical executives comment around this. They do not link drug costs with their research. They say this out loud. They admit that the estimate of income based on the consideration of the price of a drug is the number one consideration. That is, the anticipated income stream based on what can be charged is what determines the price, not repayment of sunk costs or other issues. This was Ray Gilmartin, who is the CEO of Merck. He told the Wall Street Journal. And in a convoluted way, price of medicines is not determined by research costs. Whether Merck spends $500 million or $1 billion developing a medicine, it's those paying for our medicines who will determine its true value, otherwise known as what the market will bear. Except we're not buying refrigerators, we're buying life and health. And that correlates with profit stock prices, stock buybacks that Dr. Letchin may have spoke about last week. So this myth is pervade even to today. This is just a year ago, April 2024. There were congressional hearings. Bernie Sanders requested communications from the CEO of Novo Nordisk to figure out why Ozempic and Wegovy are so costly in the US. So these drugs, of course, are not new. These are the GLP-1 agonists. They came out, and I started using them in 1995 as exenatide, by the way. They're priced in very, very different ways. Wegovy is priced for obesity, Ozempic for diabetes. Although exenatide was approved in 95, semaglutide was approved 2017. And it was just a tweaking of that molecule. And it was derived, I'm sorry, 2005, not 1995 for exenatide. And it was derived from the venom of the Gila monster. It's kind of interesting research to learn about in terms of how that got developed. Anyhow, the CEO from Novo Nordisk says it's easy to oversimplify the science that goes into understanding disease and developing and producing new treatments, as well as the intricacies of the US and global health system. So why are you questioning what the price is? Isn't this has to do all with developing new treatments? No, it doesn't. They didn't develop it. As we'll see, this is developed in academia. They buy the product once it's promising. So they're implying it's the science where it's really the profit. Here is, again, the average daily cost when semaglutide was launched in the US back in 2017. And in case at the top, the big four is referring to the VA, Department of Defense. I have to hide this thing. Bear with me. Um, Whoops, hide video panel. I didn't want to do that. Hide floating meeting control. That's what I want to do. Wanted to, the Public Health Service and Coast Guard, those are smaller groups, but those are considered the big four that negotiate over the cost of prices. The wholesale acquisition cost that's in the lighter pink. So when Ozempic was introduced in the US, compared to France, Germany, Italy, it was about, twice as expensive. That's just a par for the course. However, once it was introduced, the prices keep going up. In other countries, after introduction, the price would drop. The first price changes would drop 20% in Germany, I don't know, it's 14% here in Spain. The US it would incrementally increase such that they're astronomical today, such that they bring these folks to um, the I want to see you guys again. Sorry, that they bring um, the drugs to the U.S. Does this make sense? Um, so this myth of the grand bargain, research gets poured into the drugs that you cure people with. Once upon a time, that was true. There is reality. In my lifetime, that was true once. But did we lose somebody? Looks like we lost somebody. Did we lose Mackenzie? Um, okay. Is this getting too, or is Mackenzie, are you? Oh, there you are. We're a small enough group that if you have questions, please let me know, or if you don't understand something I'm saying, because I do want to make sure that this is comprehensible. All right. So when I was in medical school, it was the pharmaceutical houses that invented the wonder drugs. That was a long time ago. Statins, you may have heard of, the proton pump inhibitors for acid reflux and ulcers, Prozac, and all the derivative SSRI antidepressants. They were developed in-house in pharmaceutical houses. Prior to the 1980s, actually, academia was not that interested in creating new drugs. The reason was there were no incentives. Any academic patent would directly be public would remain in the public domain. They could not make a profit off of a new molecule. And America recognized that's a problem. So the Bayh-Dole Act was created. And the Bayh-Dole Act, there's got to be a better way to, anybody have suggestions how to, there's got to be a better way to do this with you. So the Bayh-Dole Act was basically um, a congressional act passed in both houses that allowed tax-funded academic researchers to patent and gain commercial reimbursement for their discoveries. And that changed everything. Essentially, okay. Well, it provided a uniform process of transferring those patents to industry and licensing something that was paid for by National Institute of Health dollars or National Cancer Institute or other tax-funded drug discoveries. The NIH and government institutions were allowed to receive intellectual property licensing fees and royalties, as were startups, small biotech startups that were academic startups. And technology transfers came to be extremely successful in increasing the development of novel drugs. Now, the NIH gets some reimbursement and funding for their product for their inventions, but not the exorbitant products made by pharma for their novel drugs. And taxpayers do not actually see that it costs less to pay for a drug invented by the NIH versus coming from in-house, which is very rare these days that it comes from in-house. Bayh-Dole does have a provision, by the way, we'll talk about again, that allows the government march-in rights. That means if the contractor has purchased one of these government-funded new molecules and is has the rights to market them, but it doesn't allow it to be either affordable, believe it or not, or available to the public, then the government can march in to break that monopoly and actually produce the product themselves. Many people are not aware of that. And we'll talk about that. So was Bayh-Dole successful? Yes. This is actually industry estimates. This is now a number of years old. Billions of dollars contributed, actually trillions of dollars contributed to gross industrial output, gross domestic out. So a very successful act that created many tens of thousands startups and employed many people to create actually impressive new drugs. So who does the groundbreaking research after Bayh-Dole? Almost all new molecular entities have their origins in academic settings, either via the National Institute of Health, think the mRNA vaccines or anti-COVID drugs, anti-cancer therapies, or via small academic affiliated startups. These are researchers who get the most of their salary from the VA or from a university or from a medical school, but they have a startup on the side where they have a promising drug that they want to refine, patent, and ultimately sell to industry. So the NIH funding contributed to the basic research for every one of the 210 new drugs approved by the FDA between 2010 and 2016. You could extend that to 2025 for almost every new drug, with grants totaling greater than $100 billion. Was this discussed by Dr. Lechton? I want to make sure I'm, oh, good. All right, so I'm good. So this is important information when you hear people, oh, if you decrease the prices of their drugs, the pharmaceutical industry is going to stop making new molecular entities. No, they won't. They make plenty of bucks off of our taxpayer-paid new developments. And of these new 210 new drugs during that period, just those 6 years, 84 of them were first-in-class products. Many of these are biologicals. And again, we're seeing many Americans not able to afford their drugs, but we've never used that margin component of Bayh-Dole to allow government to break patents. So, um, just a touch on research trials. Again, Dr. Lechton may have spoke to this, probably did. I'll just remind you then of what I'm showing you. The universities, NIH, they do studies from soup to nuts. They invent the molecule with the preclinical studies, such as the mRNA vaccines. They were studied since the 1980s. How do I take an mRNA and create a vaccine with it? That goes on for decades. They see something promising. They'll do phase 1 trials. They'll do startups to look at the safety of that drug and the dosing of that drug. Then they'll go on to phase 2 trials, all via the NIH or academia, where they'll see its effectiveness and expand the safety. Only when it gets to phase 3 trials, where it gets studied against in thousands of people, and does pharmaceutical industry step in. But there's a lot of promising information that has given information prior to that. So I'm not going to get into this because I think you did touch on that. But so today, industry only funds these late-stage clinical trials. And the National Science Foundation has done a study that shows that the drug companies, Big Pharma, only spends 1.3% of its revenue on that basic clinical trials rate. Well, sorry, on the basic research to discover new molecules. All the rest of the dollars goes to the clinical studies. And it's well documented that pharma exaggerates its research costs. It claims that it costs billions of dollars to bring a new molecule to market, actually um, includes what's called opportunity cost among those research expenditures. That means if they didn't spend those hundreds of thousands of dollars on that clinical trial and they invested it in the stock market, what would they have made? So when they say that this is a research cost, they're using such things as these tricks and games, such as opportunity cost. And they'll use their tax breaks to reduce costs further. So, in fact, at one point it was said it would cost $1 billion to bring a new molecule to market. It actually costs $90 million. And actually, this is research by Dr. Lechton. So, um, I'm not, did you guys touch on, just for my education, did you touch on the nature of clinical trials? No. All right. Well, I'll do this briefly. As we just discussed, phase 1 trials looks at drug safety, the doses ranges, pharmacokinetics. People are paid, a lot to get drawn. They have a phlebotomy done frequently, and that's when people determine that there are unacceptable side effects. That's in a small group of people. Most drugs that are studied in animals first, of course, do pass this phase. Not all drugs. Actually, interestingly, statins failed in dogs, but passed in people. Going to cause serious muscle injury and hepatitis in dogs, and hence some. But in people, it's relatively safe, by the way. It's quite so. Phase 2 trials, does a drug improve the actual outcome that's being studied? And this requires about 300 volunteers. And then you're going to see a weaning of the drugs. in terms of additional side effects and benefits, and is it actually effective? So maybe 33% of drugs will get through a phase 2 trial. The phase 3 trials, when the pharmaceutical industry gets involved, are randomized or double blind. They're expanded to thousands of patients over several years, and increase safety information, side effects, and that's what goes into the FDA package that's the medicine is labeled with. Again, 33% of drugs have already passed here, but about 30%, 25 to 30% of drugs will pass all three stages. Then you have post-marketing studies, which is after the drug's been introduced and marketed. So what proportion of, we've been hearing about, the pharmaceutical industry telling us how much they actually spend on research. This is an exploded figure. That research percentage from the total amount of their revenue pales in comparison to marketing. By the way, the manufacturing costs are high when you first set up the shop, but after you've got the drug coming off the assembly line, it's really minimal. Profits, of course, are substantial, and and so this research includes the loss of opportunity costs, which is kind of silly. Um, and so um, the other thing is the big pharma, as Lechton may have mentioned, actually pays the FDA. It funds the FDA to do their analysis of their products. It's paying the fox to guard the chicken coop. So they're also including some of their research dollars as routine FDA user fees. And it blurs the line between what they pay in marketing and research. In the old days, that's cleaned up a little bit in the US. How many of you are aware that they used to send urologists on junkets around the country? And specialists to basically learn about a product. So what would happen is people who would prescribe a drug would be identified by the pharmaceutical company. They'd get emails or get mailing invitations to travel on vacation to the Rockies during ski season or the Caribbean or whatnot. And essentially, we will do research with these physicians to see if they liked our drug or how we could market it differently or how we could, and that was accounted for as research. Well, it sort of was research in marketing, not research in their product. A classic case was Roche Pharmaceuticals in a financial report that reassigned 800 million Swiss francs. The Swiss franc costs more than a US dollar from the marketing budget to the research budget. So if you look at these numbers, they actually turn out to be identical in terms of what they were putting in marketing and how it got shifted from one site to another. Anyhow, all of this results in the pharmaceutical industries making the big bucks. They continue to do so today. And if you look at their expenditures, this is marketing, this is profit, this is research, this is what they pay in taxes. So, research and development expenditures have been studied in many other published journals, reputable studies, and it's quite clear that in the introduction of cancer drugs, the research and development expenditures totaled perhaps $9 billion. This is on all the new drugs between 2005 and 16, generated $67 billion in revenue. So they do spend money on the phase 3 clinical trials. But these pharmaceutical industry is also increasingly risk averse to invent and study new molecules. So once you have a tyrosine kinase inhibitor, once you have a PDL1, a checkpoint inhibitor. Basically, they're going to create 5 or 10 more of the same product, of the same, and sometimes there's difference, but usually very minimal differences with these Me Too drugs. The drug firms continue to increase the U.S. prices, as we've seen, after recouping their development costs. And as a consequence, their income is higher than most Fortune 500 firms, except for perhaps the health insurance industry. So here's a drug firms compared to most other firms, and now those numbers are parallel to the health industry, which is amazing. Well, welcome to the unregulated Wild West of American healthcare. Anyhow, let's look at cancer drugs. And so any questions or critiques of some of the, and okay. So if we look at specifically cancer drugs, we'll see that this is profit in red after the drug has been marketed for about anywhere from 1 to 5 years. Costs for distribution is in gray. Production, against once you've got the product produced and you're now into your second or third year, this is how much is going to be actually accounting for sunk costs. The research and development costs are pretty minimal. Here's a checkpoint inhibitor, one of the most widely used agents, Keytruda, pembrolizumab. And this chemotherapeutic agent is very widely prescribed. Look at the research and development prices compared to profit. Same with other agents here. Again, once introduced, same trend. Although the price goes down in other countries because they can negotiate, there becomes newer products that are available that they can compete with one another. The costs only go up in the US. It's quite wild. All right, so that's the world of chemotherapeutic agents that our patients benefit with. Again, if you have insurance, then the PBM is making the major bucks. A pharmacy benefit manager will learn about that. It may be less expensive, but only to an extent. It's costing everyone the mortgage of their homes. Anyhow, how about another example in the world of infectious disease? Well, you guys are familiar that hepatitis C is now curable, right? In my lifetime, interferons and various really toxic chemotherapeutic agents were introduced to try to cure hepatitis C. It's been revolutionized. If you contracted hepatitis C, you do not need to suffer cirrhosis or cancer of the liver. You could cure it at an earlier stage. And so sofosbuvir was the first of its class, which was studied via academicians who were being funded at the VA hospital and Emory University and via National Institute of Health funds. And they basically formed a biotech company and created with tax dollars of $62 million this novel molecule. They did the clinical trials on their patients, looked extremely exciting, very minimal side effects, very well tolerated. Gilead bought the rights and did some further phase 3 trials, but not, very, very expensive. They essentially, when the product was introduced in the first year in 2013, it made $10 billion in sales, recouping the amount it paid to acquire the licensing and patents within that first year. Ironically, the Veterans Administration hospital in which the clinical studies were done could not afford the cost of the drug. But it was back then that the VA was allowed to negotiate with the manufacturers and bringing the price down to an affordable level. And the VA actually pioneered some of the best clinical studies thereafter, after this public outcry, to figure out how best to provide hepatitis C drugs. So once the company is up and producing the product, costs less than $50 to make the full 12-week course. But they would price it at $90,000, 2,000 times what it costed for the manufacturing. Why? Because they can. Gilead avoids U.S. taxes by having its packaging done in Ireland, and the pharmaceuticals are made in Jordan. Um, Here's another example. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's really important to be aware of the debacle that we experience with big pharma in the US. There's a disease called chronic myelogenous leukemia, usually affects middle-aged adults. And in my career, when first diagnosed, it was fatal without a bone marrow transplant. Caused a massive splenomegaly, serious anemia. Patients were terribly fatigued, and it's now known due to a researcher by the name of Drucker back in Seattle that it was related to a single mutated gene. So chronic myelogenous leukemia is related to a defective tyrosine kinase enzyme. This is an enzyme that controls the growth of the white blood cell and prevents it from being turned off. And uncontrolled proliferation was learned to be the key. And there was a researcher who learned that this was the physiology, the mechanism, and he decided to look at thousands of molecules to see if any of them might turn off tyrosine kinase. And he did identify one. What he identified was a product called imatinib. And where was it? It was found on the shelves of Novartis, previous developed in the 1960s by Siga Geigy. That's a pharmaceutical company that no longer exists. But they initially developed it to try to treat hepatitis or viruses with it. It was not found to be useful. They put it aside and ignored for decades. Well, Drucker did these clinical trials in 1998. And he begged Novartis to release enough of the drug that he could do a clinical trial. He first found it was useful in the lab that they provided it for him. Then he wanted to do the phase 1 and 2 clinical trials, and Novartis reluctantly gave him a few grams. And what he found was that this product essentially cured chronic myelogenous leukemia. Well, this is now the standard of care for folks with chronic myelogenous leukemia. It offers a near normal life expectancy and a potential for remission. And it's a life-saving drug, but by the way, that needs to be taken for a lifetime. That, if somebody has to take a drug every day for a lifetime, that sounds like a blockbuster, right? Doesn't it? It's great for the pharmaceutical industry. So this is the tyrosine kinase inhibitor in red, imatinib, basically blocking the action of the enzyme. Um, uh, so Novartis decided to take back that they didn't have to pay for the patent. They had provided it free of charge, and it was already theirs. So they introduced the drug in 2001, initially that first year. Let's see what happens. At $26,000 per year. They did none of the studies, it was sitting on their shelf. They did the clinical trials, which were very easy to do. They had it for 12 years, and just before expiration, this is a cancer drug a patient has to take every day. It went up to $120,000 a year. Sorry. And then the brand name, just before the generic was released, was bumped up to $146,000. Ah, generics finally available, right? We'll learn about how generics and the gamesmanship with generics plays a role. The generic came out. It's still $8,000 a month, and the brand name costs $9,000 a month. Anybody hear about anti-competitive action? So these are some of the generics: gefitinib, afatinib. They're all copycat drugs, all Me Too drugs, and they're all priced at that same amount. That's called a cartel. So, the price is now finally coming down, but as of a few years ago, there were 50 competing FDA approved tyrosine kinase inhibitors. Outside of the US, it would be minimal. Here in the US, 5 years ago, it was anywhere from $4 to $78 a pill. 21 years after the drug was first marketed, when for a drug that was invented in the 1960s. So again, just more examples of, and here's just this absurd cost of the generic tyrosine kinase inhibitors. All the other countries, so on your extreme left is the cost in the US in 2017. On your right is Latvia, the UK, Spain, France, Canada, South Africa, etc. All the other countries and how they're priced. That is now coming down, such that in 2025, you will see that the prices seem to be better. What's the cost of imatinib, this generic drug from the 1960s? Whoops. Well, the wholesale acquisition cost may be as cheap as $1,800 for a year's supply from Sun Pharmaceutical. I think it's even less than that. However, the average wholesale price that goes to the pharmacy gets jacked up extraordinarily, as you could see here. That average wholesale price expands exponentially. Why is that? Well, that's not due to research or marketing issues. That gets to pharmacy benefit managers and a whole bunch of other stuff that we're going to talk about as well. I don't want to blow your minds on a different topic, but basically, as we saw, the acquisition cost means you're a wholesaler. There's three major wholesalers, McKesson and a couple of others in the US. They basically will pay the drug manufacturer, Sun manufacturer, whoever it is, all right, I'm going to give you $1,400 for a year's supply of imatinib, this life-saving drug. Then they will jack up the price to the pharmacy or have the manufacturer make a deal for rebates with the pharmacy benefit manager that works with the insurer, the Medicare Advantage insurer or the Part D insurer, and jack up the price dramatically to list their product on the formulary. We're going to get into that in more detail. I didn't want to blow your minds with this stuff, but there's lots of different ways that drugs start to be extraordinarily costly in the US. It's not just, so here's an example of generics that should be extraordinarily inexpensive. They're out there, the prices come down, but they're still extraordinarily expensive because of other processes at play. You'll have some additional talks about pharmacy benefit managers and the like. Getting back to the pharmaceutical industry, however, we talked about Me Too drugs. They offer marginal value due to tweaking of a molecule to come up with a new patent. They're designed not with extra clinical benefit as any of the goal, but purely with profit. And it's well recognized that Medicare could have saved $17 billion over a 6-year period by substituting 12 older near identical drugs for the newer Me Too drugs that get sold to people on Medicare Advantage via these pharmacy benefit managers, getting them placed on the formulary as a more expensive product. Um, and one of the examples, again, not to belabor that point, proton pump inhibitors I mentioned as an example. Omeprazole, which is Prilosec, which is the first product, I think it came out of Merck as well, is easily tweaked by turning it around, by basically making the D isomer into an L isomer, into esomeprazole, which is Nexium, the purple pill. As it turns out, Nexium is less expensive, less effective than Prilosec, the original agent. But they charged it at a higher cost because they had great marketing. The purple pill. You guys may not don't watch television or see this on your feeds, but in my lifetime, that was really well done. It was about 10 times less, well, 5 times less effective, 10 times more expensive. Bunch of other Me Too drugs, lansoprazole, pantoprazole, rabeprazole, etc. All tweaks of the same molecule. And basically, those pharmaceutical industry research diminishes the incentive for novel drugs that might be more effective. Here's just splitting the isomer into its alternative. Um, I do think government, and in my lifetime and your lifetimes, there are examples of government and the private pharmaceutical industry collaborating effectively to save lives in a national emergency. We talked a little bit about mRNA vaccines, and they were studied at the University of Pennsylvania for many years via publicly funded research, barely funded, and it was recognized during the COVID era that it could serve as a platform to create rapidly with genetic alterations effective vaccines. So the CARES Act in 2020. Again, New York City is decimated, San Francisco decimated. They have refrigerated morgues sitting outside of hospitals and in vans because of how many people are dying from this. March of 2020, this CARES Act was passed. I was under Trump, designating $10 billion for Operation Warp Speed. via the National Institutes of Health and BARDA. And there were 8 private companies that were selected. They agreed to manufacture and distribute any of the vaccines they discovered to the US public, and a need to rapidly develop these drugs was recognized. The problem is venture capitalists and private investors would be very uninterested in funding these emergent, rapidly needed vaccines because vaccines, for the most part, have a low return on investment. It takes a lot of research and development. Well, as it turns out, Health and Human Services guaranteed the infrastructure to make the plants if the vaccine would prove to be effective. Again, how things change in 5 years. Health and Human Services eliminated the market risks by saying that they were going to advance a purchase for these drugs. They're going to pay up front. And they agreed with the industry. They eliminated the red tape through emergency use authorization. They collaborated on the vaccines via a massive government program. And it successfully produced essential vaccines at an unimagined rate. They were available a year afterwards. It was really amazing. 2021, I got my first vaccine as a professional working with patients with COVID. And again, I wish that the marketing for the drug and the education of the American public was as good as Operation Warp Speed, because God knows that was a failure. So getting Americans to accept the vaccine was not as effective as producing it. However, okay, great example of collaboration. How about the cost to America? Well, the total market sales between just in one year in 2022 was $124 billion. And Pfizer vaccine sales, this is now one of those pharmaceutical industries probably now is about $100 billion by 2025. Moderna is probably $60 billion. Or essentially, during the 2022, they were making $1,000 of profit per second. And not just that, it just blew my mind. Moderna was making all these bucks. They tried to fully claim the RNA patent for the RNA developed vaccines because they claimed that 3 scientists from the National Institute of Health were supposedly not co-inventors, which was actually not true. And it complicated the government's ability to license and share the vaccine in other countries while that claim that, that patent claim was going on. It was just outrageous. Essentially, it was dropped because they were not they were in the wrong. So I think I'm hopefully have provided you enough information to say that the myth that the pharmaceutical industry is expending their dollars on research and that's why drugs cost as much as they did, and that myth hopefully will continue to be debunked. Um, and I'm just going to skip through this because we will talk about some newer efforts in terms of reform around this. Um, and so this is a little premature on the Inflation Reduction Act from 2022. So when you talk with friends and colleagues, does it ever come up, oh, the drugs cost so much because they invent such wonderful products? Have you ever heard that from your peers or from other people? No? Yeah, Zachary.
Honestly,
Mm-hmm.
people that I talk to seem to just like dislike the drug companies and
Indeed.
there's no positive aspects that they typically will comment on. It seems like kind of taboo to defend them, just because of all the publicity that's happened about how negative they are.
Indeed. I think that the world has changed on that in that regards. You will still hear people in medical circles, however. Maybe they all have gray hair, maybe they don't. I heard this questions from students 5 years ago. I guess maybe their parents worked in the pharmaceutical industry. I don't know. I didn't ask the student. But so, I mean, I think it's the evidence is so clear. Yes, I mean, I think the industry is really reviled, as is the health industry. and we'll talk, and the health insurance industry particularly. But I think it's important to be armed with this knowledge because this will come back again. These companies are cagey. Okay. Have I belabored that enough? Should we move on? Do you guys need a bio break? Or do you want to plug on? Yeah? Okay. And do ask questions if they as they pop up. Okay. So now we're going to talk about patents and gaming the system to maintain a monopoly over the production of a drug via a variety of techniques, pay for delay, evergreening, orphan drugs, packet thickets, etc. We want to talk about not Bayh-Dole, which was talking about transfer of technology from academia. This is all about generic drugs. Hatch-Waxman and orphan drug law and were produced to this legislation was to promote generics and supposedly to reduce costs. We'll learn about its flaws and unintended consequences with that legislation. We'll learn about gaming practices by Big Pharma. And again, in this section, we'll talk a little bit about recent legislation for reform. So, problem 1970s. It took 12 years for a brand name drug to become available as a generic. They're actually in the US and the world, there are relatively few generic drug products during that decade. I know that's 50 years ago, but it's still relevant to what we experience today. So there was a dearth of generic drugs during the 1970s. It was recognized we have to speed up the process. And hence the Hatch-Waxman Act 1984, which accelerated the approval process for how a brand product could become a generic and supposedly lower drug prices. What was developed was a concept of an abbreviated new drug application. So essentially, if you are a generic drug manufacturer and you could prove that your drug coming off of your assembly line is identical in its appearance, in its molecular composition, um, as the brand name drug, you did not need to do additional clinical trials to document its bioequivalence. If the drug was demonstrated to be the same drug, the same molecule, you didn't have to demonstrate its bioequivalence. And so this was clearly, and whereas in the 1970s you had to do so, and it was fruitless because if the drug was properly made, that would be, of course, always the case. It was a dramatic change in things. Phase 3, 4 clinical trials didn't need to be repeated. And one additional incentive for generic manufacturers is if you're the first generic company to offer that product, after you gain hold of the patent, by the way, you get exclusivity for 180 days. So for half a year, if you're the first generic to apply for an abbreviated new drug application, you get approval from the FDA. It's yours as the generic product, so you can market it at a price that's going to be not competing with other generics as well. So far, so good. But there happened to be a clause in Hatch-Waxman. It was recognized that when a generic company applies for an approval of a drug that's currently brand name, it will trigger a patent dispute. So, patent law, which is pretty arcane when it comes to pharmaceuticals, treated the filing of an abbreviated FDA application as an act of patent infringement. Hey, we have the patent on this drug. Generic company, why are you trying to produce this? Well, it would allow for the resolution of the patent dispute before the generic or biosimilar product is marketed. So basically, if you have one molecular entity and you've patented it, and it's now 7 years, your patent is worn off, you could dispute that fact, but you're going to lose that case because you haven't done anything to the molecule. Well, as we'll see, there's lots of things you could do to a molecule or its distribution or marketing that can make a patent not available to generic companies. That was not calculated by the Hatch-Waxman when it was created. Just figured it'd be a routine patent dispute that would easily get overturned, and the generic company could make their product. So the goal was encouraging early resolution of such simple disputes, but the effect has been just the opposite. So, are people okay on understanding this? So when you have a patent on a product, you have a certain amount of time you have exclusivity. With pharmaceuticals, it changes from decade to decade. Let's call it 7 years. If it's a simple patent, after 7 years, you lose patent exclusivity. You still have to go through a legal process because there's ways that that patent may have changed. You may have added things to it, as we'll see. So anyhow, in 1984, it was estimated that when planning to market a generic drug, the generic company would first notify the brand company that they're filing for an abbreviated new drug application. The brand company would have 45 days to decide if they'd sue the generic application for infringement of their patent. They assumed that they wouldn't if the drug was not enforceably controlled on patent. However, what they didn't realize is the brands would always sue. They'd wait 45 days, and Hatch-Waxman allows an additional 30 months of an automatic period for the parties to litigate. So the brand manufacturers always sue the generic manufacturer for patent infringement, and they get 30 months of extended monopoly because of lawyers. They're very good at extending these patent suits. And again, as we'll see, they extend these suits in a serial fashion for various new patents they put on the original molecule. Um, so, sorry. Uh, so sorry, I'm all over the place here. Oh gosh, pardon me. Um, the other thing is Hatch-Waxman allowed the brand company to have 3 years of exclusivity to their drug if they decide to release that same drug as an over-the-counter product. So the FDA does, you need additional studies to allow something to be approved over the counter, but drug companies also extend their patent by doing so. So we have an industry now of drug patent law. Um, the patent extension, anti-competitive practices have exploded that keep generic and brand drug costs artificially high. And here's now, was Hatch-Waxman successful to some extent? Yes. If you and in fact, the U.S. excels in the percentage of generic drugs it has compared to other countries. So there are pros and cons of all this legislation. The upside is, as you see in 2019, the U.S. Had as much as 90% of prescriptions were on generics. So that is ACE inhibitors and proton pump inhibitors and SSRIs and all the other blockbuster drugs, including some of the tyrosine kinase inhibitors we just talked about and cancer drugs and other stuff. The U.S. has actually excelled in accelerating the availability of generic drugs. And as a consequence, drug spending would be 20% was relatively low for that 90% of dispensed prescriptions. And this is compared to other countries. So the Hatch-Waxman did have some positive effects. I'm going to skip this. This is something we just talked. Oh, well, but unfortunately, the patent thickets and the patent law has prevented those drugs coming onto the market fast enough. Um, Maybe I will explore this just briefly. We're talking about phase one, two, three, four clinical trials. Let's take a look at the new drug application process. But did Dr. Lechton do this? Talk about this? Okay. Um, so here's a new molecule, typically invented with your tax dollars, NIH or a bio startup company also funded by the NIH. The basic research may go on for typically for decades. The drug gets invented. Oh, this is really exciting. I'm going to get a patent for this molecule. Do these preclinical phase trials, then you are looking at animals, then you get to people. This is really exciting. It's working. We're curing. We're stamping out disease. And then still funded by the NIH and tax dollars, the pharmaceutical company buys the patent and licensing agreements are made, and you get a new drug application by the FDA. When a pharmaceutical company buys that product, they apply to the FDA and they get authorization based on those phase 3 trials that they've now funded. They were involved in funding. This product can now come to market. Great. You have a period of time anywhere from 7 to 15 years where you have exclusivity as the brand company for your new drug. Okay. You have some post-marketing studies that are mandated by the FDA, but basically you raise the price as the market will bear. And importantly, you want to add as many patents to that original molecule you've developed so you can get additional patents to prevent a generic company from being able to lay claim to it. Okay, here it is. You've got FDA approval. It gets marketed here. 7 years later, the patent expires. But in the meantime, so after the patent expires, the generic company applies for the abbreviated new drug application. The lawsuits follow. Okay, remember, you've got 30 months of an automatic people in courtrooms. It's just routine where that generic does not get approved. And you've got all these new patents that get created during this, beforehand and during this time, that extends the process even further. So it could be anywhere from 5 to 7 years or 15 years before you ever see that generic. And we're going to see some examples of this. So, how do drug makers prevent their patents from expiring? Evergreening. That is, just before their patent expires, they know the patent's going to expire here. They put on some new patents right around there, just before the drug expires. And they create either an altered feature of the initial drug that can include the coating on the tablet or the drug distribution system if it has potential side effects or carcinogenic side effects or teratogenic side effects. So you evergreen, or you create additional trivial patents with the hope that the generic company cannot get through the thicket of patents that have been created. There's another process, product hopping. So just as you know that their patent is going to expire, you've got another newer drug on your shelves that you're going to start intensely marketing to replace that older drug that's going to have generic competition. So you can market it at a higher rate, higher cost. And then you get what seems extraordinarily, it seems like antitrust to have pay for delay, where the brand company pays a generic company to not manufacture the competing drug. Although that's supposedly arising in the context of a settlement over a patent litigation, you're basically, the brand company is saying, hey, if you don't, I'm going to pay you for not producing the drug. You don't even have to start up your own company to create the assembly line. I think that's a good deal for you, don't you? So this is what is legal. And this is called life cycle management of patents. And the average number of patents that a drug will accumulate since 1984 in Hatch-Waxman has gotten to 71 patents for top-selling drugs. Back in Hatch-Waxman, maybe there are 3 patents. A new sort of long pharmacokinetic distribution, so you only have to take it once a day rather than 3 times a day. All right, that's a legitimate patent. Time release product, a new capsule instead of a tablet. That's a legitimate patent. but they come up with so many trivial patents. And here's an example of one of the first biomolecules used for Crohn's disease, used for rheumatoid arthritis, other autoimmune disorders, Humira, adalimumab, monoclonal antibody, best-selling drug in 2018. Its patent expired in 2016, but within the 3 years when it was going to expire, AbbVie applied for 247 patents and actually obtained 137 patents that would extend its monopoly to 2034. That is, if you have a new patent you extend out, you get additional exclusivity by law. It's pretty amazing. So that's the issue of patent thickets and extension of patents. There's another, and we may touch on that a little bit further. Were you guys aware of this? Yeah, this is important knowledge. There's current legislation trying to counter this, but it's pretty wild. Um, then we get to the world of orphan drugs. What the heck is an orphan drug? Well, there are so many rare diseases. In fact, we're seeing this now with rare genetic diseases. We're now tweaking people's genome to cure an inherited lifelong disorder. In 1983, we're going back some time, the Orphan Drug Act was created. That was actually before Hatch-Waxman. So what was recognized is there were diseases that affected small, quote unquote, markets. They're rare. They only affected less than 200,000 people. But there was no incentive. There was no return on investment for a pharmaceutical industry to develop a drug for so few people. So there had to be some kind of incentive to reward drug makers to create and market such drugs. This Orphan Drug Act allowed special tax incentives and exclusive rights to the marketing of these drugs, no matter how they were developed. So it's independent of patent. You could have, if you could market a particular drug, you'd have exclusive rights independent of patent for 7 years. Here's an example. Thalidomide. Have you all heard of thalidomide? I assume, yeah. Thalidomide is sort of the demonstration of the FDA and its value to the American public because this was a drug widely used in the 1950s as a sedative and an anti-nausea drug in Europe to folks who are pregnant. But the FDA prevented its approval in the US because it was subsequently documented to cause serious birth defects. So thalidomide never came for its initial purposes. But the companies using and that had patent on thalidomide realized, this drug can treat leprosy. And so this was done again by academic researchers looking for leprosy is not a common disease. The only people who'd be studying it would be the academicians, not the pharmaceutical industry. Well, it was found to be effective for leprosy, and the Celgene Corporation, which did not invent it and had no patents on it, decided to buy the rights to receive FDA approval as an orphan drug in 1998 for leprosy. So the patents have expired, but they had the marketing rights. It was exclusive to them because of Orphan Drug Act. Guess what? Thalidomide was actively studied by the Celgene Corporation, and kudos to them, demonstrated to be valuable for multiple myeloma. Well, multiple myeloma is not an orphan disease. 30,000 people every year develop multiple myeloma. So cumulatively, it's a lot more than 200,000 people. But because it was initially designated an orphan drug for them, they now use that designation to apply to multiple myeloma. Ah, again, they never held the patent. The patent expired. They had the marketing rights, exclusive marketing rights under the Orphan Drug Act. Then Celgene decided to patent its risk evaluation and mitigation system. We talked about it being teratogenic. So they wanted to make sure in their goodwill that people did not take it who were pregnant. But they got additional patents. Now they did get patents on ways to administer it to prevent people who are pregnant from taking it. So Celgene extended its orphan drug applicability to its use in multiple myeloma for multiple additional years, not based on any patent they held on the molecule, but on the patent they held on how it was distributed. Well, just before they were going to lose their final patents on the distribution process, they decided to take off the shelf a new chemically treated product called lenalidomide, which is Revlimid used for multiple myeloma. And as the thalidomide patents were expiring, the generics were going to make it, they did product hopping. That is, they took off the marketing for thalidomide and only marketed lenalidomide. And so lenalidomide they did patent, and as each new patent on that agent was about to expire, they found a new indication for the drug. So you could also patent what a drug is effective for. And again, you have to do the studies to demonstrate that. So there's some merit in that, but there's still an orphan drug. This is no longer an orphan definition. A lot of people have many different forms of lymphoma and myeloma, as we discussed, but they're still extended under orphan drug law. So in 2016, they made $7 billion on revenue on thalidomide and lenalidomide. And basically, in 2016, a drug that they never developed or invented, a month's supply would cost anywhere from $5,000 to $9,000 for the drug that was produced in the 1950s. Lenalidomide, twice as much. And here's just an example of the patents on lenalidomide, the tweaked molecule of thalidomide. Here is the first patent in 1996. All these other patents over 20 years, so no other generic company can create a similar product. Something that you might know a little bit about, which is Suboxone. We've had an epidemic, really a life-threatening epidemic of substance abuse in the United States. Quite tragic. This is a drug that works. This helps people stay off of opioids and not die from opioid overdose. So you may not be aware that Suboxone was an orphan drug. Suboxone is a raise of hands. How many of you have heard of Suboxone? Anybody? Natalia, Zachary? Okay, maybe Shrindi. So Suboxone is a really important drug. This is life-saving for folks who have opioid addiction. The product is created of two generic drugs developed in 1961, which is naloxone, and buprenorphine in 1966. So these drugs are long off patent. When the drug maker, Indivior, decided to apply for orphan drug eligibility, it was not felt to be economically viable as they claimed, because they were only going to offer it at methadone clinics. There aren't that many methadone clinics around the United States. They told the FDA, no, we're only going to offer it at methadone clinics. As a consequence, that's probably less than 200,000 people, uh, and it got drug protection for 7 years. They didn't hold the patents, they had the marketing exclusivity. Well, oh, never mind. I guess we're going to extend it beyond methadone clinics. And again, because it was so successful in those clinics, it was a good thing that it was extended beyond that, so that many other prescribers could offer the drug. But its sales generated $2 billion within a year or so. As its exclusivity for those marketing rights ended, it then claimed that the tablets were dangerous. Maybe some legitimacy to that. If a young child could take the Suboxone, they may have some toxicity from it. So they claim this. As a consequence, they developed a less addictive and safer orally disintegrating film. By the way, it's not less addictive. And it turns out that the film is no safer than the tablets. Kids can still put them in their mouths. That's called product hopping again. they decided to actually take the tablets off the market. That's a hard patent shift. They actually going to do a hard switch by getting the tablets off the market and just sell the more expensive Suboxone that can't be generically competed with. Well, the Department of Justice actually, back in a time when they did such things, indicted Indivinar because, in fact, that study was wrong. It was not safer and it was not less quote unquote addictive. This is being used for folks with opioid addiction. And they were able to prevent Indivinar from overcharging their tablets as the patent expired. So that was a rare successful intervention for something that should be done on a daily basis by the FTC and Department of Justice. Um, there's a thousand different examples of the things that are just amazing. Again, I know you guys are in your second years rising and you're in college, but have you ever heard of colchicine? Raise your hands. Anybody hear of colchicine? Yeah. Colchicine was a drug developed in in the 1800s. This was an effective drug for gout. And in my career, I'd, write a prescription for colchicine if if I knew that they didn't have, couldn't afford more expensive products, I'd write for colchicine. It would cost 9 cents a pill. All of a sudden, in the 2000s, I would prescribe colchicine. The patient would call my office and say, I can't afford the pill. I scratched my head and said, what? This drugs came out in the 1800s. Why can't you afford it? Ah, turned out that the FDA decided, perhaps appropriately, to start to require grandfather drugs to be studied for effectiveness. So things like colchicine, digoxin, a variety of other drugs, aspirin, low-dose aspirin. Again, Bayer in 1900 created this drug. The FDA said, hey, we want to make sure these drugs are properly studied. So in doing so, the FDA granted market exclusivity to any company willing to do that study to prove the effectiveness of a grandfather drug and its safety. And if they do prove it, they get an orphan designation. So colchicine suddenly got the patent, the marketing for it was purchased by a company, and they demonstrated what we already knew that it was effective for gout compared to placebo, and they jacked its price up astronomically. Thousand other drugs, ACTH, which is a adrenocorticotropic hormone, a thousand other examples. And then, same company that did the studies to prove that colchicine works for gout extended its patent by finding that it also happens to work for familial Mediterranean fever, again, extending out its patent. Here's an example, pyrimethamine, a grandfather drug that was initially orphaned because of it was used for parasitic infections. This was before HIV. So these parasitic infections were fairly rare. However, HIV changed that all. He purchased the patent for marketing and raised the cost of the drug from $2 a pill to $750 a pill. That was legal. He actually ended up in jail for tax fraud, but everything else he was doing was legal. The orphan drug issue is a really serious drug to this day. We talked briefly about pay for delay. That's a serious antitrust. The Sherman Antitrust Act really should prevent that. The Hatch-Waxman law, again, as I mentioned, gave the first generic company to declare it'll manufacture the drug 6 months of exclusivity. So it can make a lot of profit in those first 6 months once it's granted that it does not have a patent infringement. However, what the brand companies figured out is, during that litigation process, let's meet on the side. Maybe we could settle out of court. And you know how one way we could settle around this patent issue? How about we give you royalties or remuneration for not making your generic? As a win-win for the drug maker, a win-win for the brand company as well as the generic companies, and of course, only the consumers lose. There's 1,000 examples of this. Teva, a generic company, applied to create Effexor, commonly prescribed antidepressants. Um, the brand company said, "Hey, if you don't enter the market for 5 years, we'll pay you to not do that." 1,000 different examples. Lidoderm, and again, these are drugs that I've seen in my career not become available. I knew the patent expired, and I couldn't figure out why is it not affordable. Well, again, this really all is antitrust. Companies should not be allowed to do this. But the well reimbursed congressmen and senators have decided not to introduce any or give teeth to the FTC. There are senators and representatives who have tried to introduce some anti-competitive law. So the Fairness and Drug Exclusivity Act and Access to Affordable Generics Act, these are just some examples. Klobuchar and other House representatives and Senator Klobuchar did not get passed in both houses. You may not be aware, but currently in 2025, they're actually bipartisan. Grassley, Cornyn, Blumenthal, and Durbin. There is legislation, Affordable Prescription for Patients Act, which limits the number of patents a branded drug maker can bring into those patent infringement suits. The Drug Competition Enhancement Act, same bipartisan sponsors, target this process of product hopping, taking your well-marketed previous drug that's losing its patent expiration and substituting marketing for a barely tweaked alternative molecule that you did have patents on. So essentially, they're trying to legislate this as violations of the Federal Trade Commission Act that goes back centuries. The Supreme Court, of course, should be already doing that, but that's not the world we live in. So there are various other proposals, and we talked about margin rights under Bayh-Dole, which allows the government to use royalty-free an invention patented, if it was patented by federal funding, to allow the government to actually manufacture that drugs if the pharmaceutical company doesn't allow it to be offered either at a reasonable price or adequately to the public. All right. So we're going to briefly talk about the IRA and how that might affect drug pricing. It's now 10:36. We'll do this just for a few minutes. I'm gonna need to take a bio break. Do you guys want to take a break for 5-minute break? How does that sound? Okay, good enough. See you back in 5. Well, let me just ask you, have you guys already tackled the Inflation Reduction Act? No, okay. So this was a time long ago, at least a year ago. Um, and let me talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. So the major change was an amendment by Congress to eliminate this non-interference clause. So Medicare was now allowed to negotiate with the pharmaceutical industry. And it initially was allowed to negotiate with over the cost of 10 drugs that costs are not going to be lowered until next year. Interesting. This was passed in 20, I think 22 or and so it got delayed till a future administration. So the initially 10 drugs would be added in 2026. Then for each additional year, there would be anywhere from 15 and expanded up to 20 drugs. There would be 15 drugs negotiated over on a yearly basis over the next decade. So that's a lot of drugs after 10 years. Um, who would do the negotiation would be the Secretary of Health and Human Services. I don't think they're counting on RFK Jr. to be doing so, but we'll see. So the secretary would negotiate the price of a product with the drug companies if they were a single source brand name drug that would not have a generic or biosimilar competitor. So drugs would be selected uh, for this negotiation. Among those 50 drugs with the highest Medicare Part D spending, and the 50 drugs with the highest Medicare Part B, those are clinic delivered drugs as well. In negotiating, so now it's Health and Human Services instead of instead of the Swedish analysis systems or NICE in Britain or Germany's programs. Basically, Health and Human Services negotiate a maximum fair price that had to use various criteria. It would include the research and development costs, and to the extent to which the pharmaceutical industry had already recouped those costs, it would determine prior federal support for the development of the drug, which in many cases is extensive. It would look at the current revenue from that drug, sales, cost of production and distribution, and look at the importance of that drug, the effectiveness of the therapy, how much that drug was a therapeutic advance, a first-in-class product, or what alternatives there were to that particular drug. All that would go into determining the maximum fair price that HHS must use. And if a drug company decided not to negotiate with Health and Human Services, it didn't comply with that process, they'd have a huge excise tax levied on the drug company. So um, it would limit also arbitrary increases. We've seen that companies would introduce a product at a certain price and then jack it up based on its popularity or its effectiveness and based on what the market could bear. The Inflation Reduction Act not just selected drugs to negotiate the price over, but also prevented companies from increasing the cost above inflation. Now, Medicaid does this already. It limits price increases by requiring a rebate from manufacturers to Medicaid, if not to a PBM, but to Medicaid if the price grows greater than inflation. But Medicare never had any such authority. Now, the Inflation Reduction Act requires the drug maker to pay a rebate to the federal government if the price for a biological or a drug under a Part D or clinic administered Part B drug increases faster than the rate of inflation. And it also, a separate component of the Inflation Reduction Act, it limits cost sharing for insulin for people on Medicare, but that was also expanded across the board, not just to Medicare. As we will see, when they decided to set the price for people on Medicare, that is, I don't necessarily even have, I decided I'm on traditional Medicare and I can't afford to pay a premium for Medicare Part D. So I pay out of pocket, but my insurance is Medicare. I would still be limited to $35 to pay for my insulin. So the monthly cost sharing for insulin products was limited to $35 if I was a Medicare beneficiary. And it eliminated deductibles on Medicare Part D and copays, etc. As we'll see, that had other ramifications. It also would eliminate the out-of-pocket drug spending by anybody who has Part D to $2,000. And it delayed the Trump administration's drug rebate rule that also saved Medicare dollars. That's a different issue. So, um, what drugs are not eligible to be negotiated over? Well, any drug that's been initially marketed for less than 7 years, or any biological monoclonal antibodies that's been initially marketed for less than 11 years. Um, Biotech drugs, again, um, uh, don't account for a lot of Part D or Part B spending, but they are expensive. And drugs with Medicare spending less than $200 million are also excluded. So if you're so if it's 7 years for a tablet and 11 years for a biological, it will not be negotiation. If Medicare spends less than $200 million per year on your product, it would be excluded from negotiation. And orphan drugs are excluded, which is, as we've seen, it can be easily gamed. Plasma-derived products are also excluded. Um, of interest, we've talked. You probably, Thomas, discussed how do governments look at the value of a particular drug? That is, if it extends one's life expectancy by 1 month, is it really worthwhile spending the umpteen dollars on? Well, in this Inflation Reduction Act, there was a concern about ageism, which I have, even as a geriatrician taking care of the elderly, I do value, I think, the life of a younger person in terms of a life extension, of course, than that of an older person. But because of some concerns around this, it was said that the Secretary of Health and Human Services shall not use evidence from comparative clinical effectiveness research in a manner that treats extending the life in an elderly, that's one thing, disabled, terminally ill individual as of lower value than extending the life of an individual who's younger, non-disabled, or not terminally ill. I don't personally agree with that, but that's my own perspective. And we can talk about the ethics of that. Um, anyhow, okay, so um this is all elements of the Inflation Reduction Act, and what's the timeline? Well, initially in 2023, if their product was, this is already instituted, if a pharmaceutical company is boosting the costs higher than inflation, that pharmaceutical company has to pay a rebate to the federal government. That got implemented rapidly. But the IRA passed in 2022. Um, if you were on insulin, and had Medicare, your costs would not be more than $35 per month. And as we'll see, that extended to people not on Medicare, which is a fortunate thing. It also reduced the cost and improved coverage for adult vaccines. The next year, 2024, it eliminated coinsurance for Part D catastrophic insurance, expanded eligibility for other subsidies, and it expanded the out-of-pocket cap for Part D, but the drugs really don't start to get negotiated over in terms of what you're actually paying for them until 2026 next year. What are those drugs that are getting negotiated over? Eliquis, I use it all the time. Apixaban, a very good product. I think it's much safer than other anticoagulants like warfarin out there. Very expensive. It was approved in 2012. The price will come down dramatically, even though the company has extended multiple patents. Enbrel, not Humira, but another similar monoclonal antibody. Farxiga, used for diabetes. It's an SGLP2 inhibitor. Entresto, needed for heart failure. Again, 1,000 different drugs here. Jardiance, another SGLP2, and Xarelto, another anticoagulant. Those are 2026 drugs. 2027 drugs. Ozempic. There's a lot of lawsuits going on right now around these GLP agonists for weight loss and for diabetes, a variety of inhalants for COPD. Anyhow, so um, will the Inflation Reduction Act bring down costs? Yes. Um, so list price in 2024 for this very frequently prescribed apixaban, Eliquis, it'll not be half, but it'll be almost half of no, it will be half of current prices um, in terms of list price. However, the negotiated prices um, are not as low as they will be in Europe. So if you look at what's going to happen in Europe, these Medicare negotiated drug prices were still almost as 4 times as much as the average of these drug prices in other countries. So it has an effect, but it still offers plenty of profit on a yearly basis for these older drugs. So will there be CBO did estimate savings to the taxpayer, to Medicare, $100 billion of savings just over the drug prices. In terms of cost for inflation in Medicare Part D, 60 billion. These other actions which help beneficiaries actually cost Medicare more. And the overall budget effect by the CBO, which is hopefully reliable, is $240 billion of federal deficit reduction. We hear a lot about federal deficit reduction these days. Um, what are some of the problems? Again, as we saw, these products are still going to cost 4 times as much as they do in Europe, even after the IRA. It's restricted to those brand drugs which don't have generic versions. However, as we saw, a lot of those generic versions don't exist because of really patent gaming. And it does nothing to reduce that patent gaming pay for delay or packets, thickets, etc. There has to be a generic. So the fact that they don't have generic versions is really kind of absurd because they should, and they should be less expensive already. Um, there's other effects on launch pricing by the pharmaceutical industry. That is, the big pharma will take this into account, and there's a concern that the drug makers will actually launch the prices for their new drugs at a higher price so that they could take into account the inflation rebates. So it's not perfect, it's a start. From my perspective, do these reforms make a difference? Yes, clinically they do make a difference. I spoke to you about my friend John here, my patient, about the absurdities of how much he was paying for his insulin. When the IRA was getting passed in 2022, um, all of the insulin makers were basically behaving as a cartel, jacking up their prices to astronomical amounts. And Americans were traveling to Mexico for insulin, not just for vacation. So here's how and I think I may have shown you this slide. There's all these drugs were going up in a sequence. Um, the downstream effect of the Inflation Reduction Act and public pressure around these absurd costs allowed efforts for non-Medicare employee-sponsored insurances to reduce costs as well. So the costs on employee-sponsored insurance and the Medicare the ACA marketplace was, even though blocked in terms of legislation, the companies were shamed. So there were efforts to actually legislate outside of Medicare. The GOP blocked it in the Senate in August of 2022. But the effect was the same. There was so much publicity around it that Eli Lilly said, okay, we're going to cap our costs just like we do for Medicare at $35 a month. Um, and by the way, all the other manufacturers did the same, and in part because the state of California was threatening that they were going to produce the product in state with their own manufacturing. So the three drug manufacturers, which accounted for 90% of the insulin in the United States, all lowered their cost to $35 per month. Those with private insurance, those with the ACA, etc. Obviously, they could have done this at any time, but only under public pressure did they respond? And there's a lesson in terms of public pressure can have effect on at least the pharmaceutical industry. Um, did Lechten talk about funding of the FDA? Mm, what time is it? All right, we're already 11 o'clock. I'm going to skip this because I think he's going to talk about this at a future time. And I think that's what I've got for you guys today. It's 11 o'clock. You guys are troopers.